Another state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Blackness Podcast. Welcome to the Blackness Podcast. this is your host, Too Black. Coming in first place.
We just want y'all to know that Black does not want anybody but himself to do the opening, and every week we record, we be racing to beat him to saying it, and so
he's the one that presses the record button. So
yeah, we had to, because people be gunning. I'm like, yo, nah. But anyway, so yeah, this is part 2 of Prisons Are Built for Profit. We actually didn't get as much pushback so far as I expected. There was a few people who said some stuff, but it's not really worth addressing. As I always say, just debate the sources. If you haven't really researched the topic, I'm not really interested in having a debate with you. Now, if you want to have a conversation, that's different, but we're not going to.
Okay, Meg the Stallion.
Yeah.
Silence is golden sometimes.
Yeah. So yeah, you can talk to live forever or whatever, like some people do, rant on there. But yeah, so this is part 2. Before we get into anything, I didn't do this in part 1, so I do want to shout out the patrons real quick. So we have Marley Abrams, Aaron Cuthbert, Adiza May, and Noah McDonald. If I missed anybody, I apologize. I believe that was all who came in. So again, thank y'all for signing up. The Patreon has seen an uptick, so we definitely appreciate that. Other than that, I want to check in with everybody's thoughts on part 2, because this is a little different. Only time we've ever done a part 2 that wasn't with a guest was, I think, the Lumumba episode. Similarly, there was just so much information. There was no way we could do it in one episode. That's what we're dealing with here. So I'm curious what y'all think as far as how part 1 went, and then also just some of the research for this episode, which is a lot more complicated than part 1.
I think part 1 sets folks up for this. This history, I think if we had given it all to y'all very, very in the beginning, a lot of y'all would have went to sleep. They've been a little confused. And so I think giving it to everybody in a manner that felt very approachable and kind of in your face, and in the ways that, from what we saw both in the comments and just in our own realizations, was like, here are all the things that were always in front of us that we weren't necessarily paying attention to, that just, as soon as you hear it, it clicks and it makes so much more sense. And I think because of episode 1, it allowed us to hopefully it'll allow y'all to then approach a lot of the background with a clear mind of already knowing what is driving, what's not driving mass incarceration, which is profit, and now understanding like what is, how do we get here? How did we get here? What did we do next? All of those things. I don't think that made a lot of sense, but it did in my head at first.
No, I think it made a lot of sense. I agree. I think it's a great idea to cut this into 2 different parts. Be more palatable for our listeners. And for the first part, it was easy to debunk, but I think for this one, going into the nitty gritty, all the details, and understanding what is driving mass incarceration is not only is it helpful, but I also think that this is a conversation that needs to be had, because I don't think, from what my understanding. And from what I see, I don't think there's too much of a conversation out there, especially in the mainstream, of what is the driving force behind mass incarceration. Because we have documentaries like The 13th that made a big splash in our culture and kind of just perpetuated this myth. So I think it'd be a good way to truly understand the prison industrial complex. Again, we have our sources, we have our research, but we also like to implore everybody that's listening to us to continue to do your research as well, to go take it further, because life's a journey. You gotta continue to learn. You gotta continue to evolve.
Like pieces of a puzzle getting put together. Last
Exactly.
episode, y'all saw the puzzle complete. Now we're collectively putting pieces together, and it's a lot more layered and complicated than we thought. This is a 1,000+ piece puzzle, not a simple 200-piece puzzle. And I think going through this also just shows how priorities and things shift throughout time. And how, of course, as individuals, like it's very easy to be like trying to make it succinct and like, what is the one reason? Which I think is how the myth gets perpetuated anyways. It's easy to just state that, well, they just want to make money off our bodies because of slavery. But even slavery wasn't just about making money off our bodies. And so in recognizing that, it allows us to step into this of being like, there's so much nuance in it. And we have to just continue to peel back all the layers. And even this is not peeling all the layers back. There's probably plenty of things that we will leave out. And there's probably a shit ton of things that are far more insidious that we're just not aware of because they don't want us to be aware of. And so, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, capitalism is one piece of the puzzle. There's some more deeper layers that we're going to get into.
Capitalism's a pretty big piece. But...
It's a pretty big piece. But what I'm saying is, as we go into empire, imperialism, and understanding what colonial settler projects are.
Go ahead, Terrell.
The shit is sinister. Like, no, it's
true.
No, because like the way like Cam said, the pieces of the puzzle in like the first episode, just breaking down that part of the myth. Now I'm like, okay, what's if not for profit, what's the reason? And we get more into that into this episode, and it pisses me off, but it's like I never would have thought any of this. So it's a learning experience, and even to think that, like we said, we're getting a piece of the puzzle, like, okay, even completing this section of it, we still don't have the full picture. It gets deeper.
Yeah, I think there was something that came out. It was funny. Somebody shared this with me. Something came out like this week after we dropped the episode. This article came out in Associated Press, I believe, and it was prisons in the U.S. are part of a hidden workforce linked to hundreds of popular food brands, and it starts going over how all these different food brands made, like, I think $200 or $300 million. Like we talked about in part one, this is the stuff that the media tends to focus on, is these stories of somebody making money off prisoners. And again, nobody's saying that that's okay or that's nothing. It's just in comparison, again, what are we talking about? And I think Craig Gilmore is actually the husband of Ruth Wilson Gilmore. He shared something on Twitter. He was like, I said $200 million over 6 years amounts to $33 million a year. He said Target sold $21 billion of food and beverages in 2021. California's prison budget is $19 billion. $33 million a year is a drop in the bucket for either. Right. Yeah. So if Target made money off of prisons, it's very small. Like it really makes up very little bit of their profits. And then if it's $19 billion a year to run prisons just in the state of California, not even like the broader, just in the state of California, that's not really a few $100 million, as bad as that looks, is not, and that's in 6 years. Really, $33 million a year is not close to 19 billion. And this is the point we made in part one, was prisons were operated at a loss. So to say profit drives it doesn't really hold up. And as I said, I think a couple times in that episode, if profit drives prison, then the removal of profit incentive would end prison. If that's the case. So
they're not even making enough to keep the lights on.
Nah, relatively speaking.
That all of these articles in the past week have come out about this, and so then it makes me question, like, what is the rationale? Is it then are there backdoor deals that are being made because folks aren't paying bills and things need to get passed and lobbying is taking place? Is it a trick in order to completely remove even work programs from prisons at all, which on the surface for folks who are just focused on the profit, that's great. But then thinking through the programs that folks can benefit from getting pulled, is that what then happens for during the rest of the day for prisoners who are going to work, who are utilizing this for skills? And not everybody does, but there are folks who need things to do, especially behind those walls, that are productive for them. Or I think about how many programs have already been pulled, like school, books, degrees. A lot of those programs, a lot of the social programs no longer exist in prisons, both in juvenile facilities as well as adult facilities. And so it's obviously it's election season, so they're putting a bunch of shit out that will then lead to people focusing on being able to talk about on their platform what they're behind and keeping crime down and wanting to keep business, give money to the poor and take it from big business, which they don't actually give a fuck about. But it's all, whenever I see shit like this, I'm like, okay,
yeah, I mean,
what's the why? Because y'all don't care actually at all, whatever the profit was going to be.
Yeah, it's a sensational headline, and it drives it. It's always going to interest people. And if newspapers are made for profit. That part is true. So you're trying to get stories that bring the attention. So who knows? I don't know. I don't even know if it really matters. I just know that the effect that these stories have ultimately lead to this misunderstanding that we've been dealing with. As we also talked about in part one, most people, even in that story, most people don't work those kind of jobs. Like most people in prison are not working jobs that corporations can profit off of for several reasons. Again, I don't want to redo that episode, but it's like there's a security issue. So you're not going to invest that much money in prison labor, because if they have to lock down the prison for a month, you've invested all that money that is now lost, right? And that's why only about 1% of people in prison work these kinds of jobs, these private sector jobs, quote unquote. Most people.
Funny on the article, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but even when you look at the cover of the article, it is a very small group of folks going out into the work, which is goes to show when we talk about, like, in a grand scheme of things, if it was a huge profit driven thing, you would see thousands of folks behind bars out doing a variety of the things that
most people wouldn't even be in a prison cell if it was actually on the scale that we're talking about. Like, most people would never even, they'd spend most of their time working. And then you would be able to call it slavery or whatever in a very literal sense. Again, I'm not saying there's no slavery components there, but I'm saying you could just say that's all it's for. If that was the point, just lock them up or whatever. So yeah, I mean, there are other few things I did want to address. As far as I had some conversations with some people about this, as far as, like, it's not to say, we'll get to this later, I'm going to go through this real quickly so we can move on, but, like, if you think about this in the grand scheme, if you have places to lock people up, you have places to just get rid of folks who can either be problems, politically, socially, etc., and they're not out committing any kind of things that destabilize day-to-day life, then that does stabilize markets. And if you're a capitalist, you can profit off of that indirectly, but you're not profiting directly off the prisons themselves overall, right? It's a way to get rid of people, and it's also a way to discipline labor. because again, if you have all these surplus laborers, we'll get to, and they're not giving them jobs, and you're just sending a lot of those folks to prison, or you're just giving them prison jobs, which aren't that great paying jobs, then that's just a way of keeping wages down. It also helps get politicians elected. But just saying prisons are driven for profit, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore said, doesn't really, she said in her words, like, these things don't tell us what to do. These are slogans. So a few sources we're going to use for the episode, and we'll get into the heart of it. Prisons make us safer, and 20 other myths about mass incarceration. This was referenced in part 1, Victoria Law. Golden Gulag, Prison Surplus Crisis and Opposition in Globalizing California by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. That's going to be our primary one that we pull from. Later in the episode, one we quote a little bit. War on Poverty and the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America by Elizabeth Hinton. Abolition Geography, Essays Towards Liberation by Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And then Black Reconstruction in America, an essay toward history of part which Black people played in an attempt to reconstruct democracy in America, 1860 to 1880 by W.E.B. Du Bois. And then also, not really going to get as much into this book, but we're going to do part 3 basically on this book, Tip of the Spear by Orisami Burton. So first, we're going to walk through the history of prisons, a very quick history of prisons, like early history, so we can understand like what was the foundation for them even starting, and then we can get into, mass incarceration, political incarceration, and then we're going to use California as kind of a case study from Golden Gulag to understand like how states as in individual states within the so-called United States build up their prison capacity, and California is a good case study to understand like how all these interests collapse to build it. Because we often talk about the war on drugs and mass incarceration, we tend to almost always talk about federal laws, but most prisons exist under state laws, under the state governments. So what do we do? How do we understand that? All right, so early history of prisons. This is Victoria Law. The modern day prison is relatively new phenomenon. She says before 1973, people were typically jailed while awaiting judgment. Their punishments were generally physical and vicious: floggings, time in stocks, executions in the United States, imprisonment as punishment began with the opening in Philadelphia's Walnut Street Jail in 1773. So before 1773 in the United States, most people were just going to a jail to await to be executed. That was it. It was just a holding spot so you could go get whatever you were due later on. There wasn't really a interest in hurling a bunch of people into cages for the sake of them sitting in cages. In 1790, again, this is Victoria Law, the jail added a new cell block, the penitentiary house. Said there people were held in complete isolation. It was the start of a new model, imprisonment as penitence. That's how we get the term penitentiary. So taking the name from the mission, the penitentiary was designed to inspire, coerce penitents and those who broke the law. People were locked alone in cells for 24 hours each day with no human contact, ostensibly to reflect on and repent their criminal actions. So now this view, we go from Terrell just in prison or jail so I can send him to be hanged to now it's like timeout, only it's a very vicious timeout. You're going to sit there for 24 hours and think about the wrong that you did. And the logic was this was actually a reform. This is the funny part about it. Like, that was considered reform. Instead of us just hanging everybody, let them think about it. That was that was the kind of logic. And it sounds ridiculous to us, but this is just what it was. And then also, reformatories, we hear about, even when we talk about Pendleton Prison, that was initially called the Indiana Reformatory, but the idea of reformatory, again, the reform aspect, reforming individuals, comes out of this like Catholic ethic, I guess, or even Protestant. I don't actually know the specifics of Christianity that it comes out of.
No, you're right. It's Catholicism, because in Catholic school when I went, there's a called Sacrament of Reconciliation, which you go to confession, and then you confess your sins, and then you're given a penance, which could be like a couple Hail Marys, a couple Our Fathers, whatever the case may be. what you're doing is to atone for your sins. So they took that same logic and they put it in prisons.
Penitentiaries.
So your penitentiaries. You are atoning for your so-called sins.
Gotcha.
Or they're trying to reform you into being a more godly woman. That's a whole nother thing for y'all to go spiral down in the research of were taking places in these reformatories. It's quite horrific. Out of these came a lot of homes for unwed mothers or people that ended up pregnant. That's a whole nother thing to go read about. But
yeah, they were made specifically. Reformatories were made specifically for women who didn't follow the conservative things of the time. They were getting drunk, premarital sex, whatever. They were too independent.
He was having too much fun.
Yeah, basically.
Like, absolutely the fuck not. We say y'all can go get a job, but
being too free.
Home, get a husband.
So for having a hot girl summer, they went to a reformatory. All right, bet.
I was waiting for that. I was so waiting for somebody to say that. I was waiting.
But some of the punishments were like lobotomies and shit. Like, it was
sterilization. Yeah. So I mean, this wasn't just on Black women. Like, this was just their view of women in general. So you can imagine what happens, you know. And that event, that didn't phase out till sometime in the early to mid 1900s, I believe. Like the 40s, I think, is when they phased that out. And so reformatories, that's so you can see, like, this is all very much about social control, more so than this is about profit. When you think about like some of the early origins of it, and now you enter us into the equation, because before the Civil War, you know, we didn't really, you know, we were on plantations. That was good enough prisons for us, you know. So there was nowhere to really, like, we weren't really in prison, you know, big. And then post the Civil War, this is where the 13th does get some things correct. They just run with this narrative a little too hard. But, you know, there was the Black codes that, you know, after here's again Victoria law. These Black codes criminalize wide range of activities such as outside after a certain hour, gathering in small groups, missing work, being perceived as vagrant, or possessing a firearm. So basically just breathing. The states also changed the seriousness of an offense. For instance, petty thievery became a felony after large numbers of newly emancipated Black people were forced to steal in order to survive. So with these former slaves walking around, and now you're trying to figure out what are ways to bring them back to do the thing they were doing when they were slaves. Like, so that's where you get a lot of this stuff.
Or even like when all this went down, this is where we see like loitering laws coming into play. And it completely shifts how prisons function. Like in Alabama, before all of this took place, prisons were just filled with white folks who, you know, they were like, Jim, get your shit together and stop hitting your wife. Dry out, go home. Or people who were really doing the fucking most, they're like, all right, well, now we just gotta hang your ass because you're doing too much. And you wreaking havoc on everything. But then literally after the Civil War, after all these Black codes, Black people began to fill the penitentiaries up. Like, I think in the research, it said that in the years following the Civil War, the imprisonment rate for Black people in Mississippi and Georgia rose 300%.
Yeah. Like in Alabama, white people were 99% the prison population before the Civil War. So yeah, like, so you can see the changeover. And this is where I think you can make the best case for driven for profit. Like, out of the entire history of prisons in this era, I still wouldn't totally agree with it, but I think that you can make a strong case for it. Because as again, the film 13 talks about the 13th Amendment, and there's this the loophole, you know, that except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. You know, slavery was convicted not convicted, was abolished except for that. Except for, you know, if you had committed a crime, slavery or involuntary servitude. And the boys, they were.
Well, I was just saying that little loophole.
Yeah. So the boy says the difficulty in this, he's talking about the 13th, the difficulty in this legalistic formula was it did not cling to the fact slavery was not abolished after the 13th Amendment. There were 4 million freedmen, and most of them on the same plantation doing the same work that they did before emancipation, except their work had been interrupted and changed by the upheaval of war. Moreover, they were getting about the same wages, and apparently were going to be subject to slave codes modified only in name. So there you get like convict leasing, and this is even worse because black codes actually were put away, and then, you know, convict leasing comes in after that, and, you know, it becomes a means of, I don't want to just to kind of move through some of this to not read all these quotes here, but it becomes a way basically again to bring the people back to the plantation. So, you know, Ruthie says, you know, South after the Civil War starting around the 1870s, the industrialists of the South were really worried. They were worried about having a labor shortage because now the slaves were free. There was really no incentive for the former slaves to work. And a lot of them didn't like the industrialists, and they wouldn't work for them unless they were compelled to. So they started arresting people, and they would give you a fine, and then to pay off your fine, you had to work. But you worked, and you worked for the same people that owned a lot of these plantations, and you were put to work. So it became an incentive to go and arrest black people and put them back to work. And this is when you could say that labor was actually the driving thing, and you could even see the profit motive involved here. In this specific era, you could see that. The problem is we try to extrapolate this era into the rest of history, and that's where it doesn't hold up. So you know, Ruthie says, but unlike the convict lease system, the difference between the latter half of the 19th century and the latter half of the 20th century is that there isn't a huge demand for their labor. So she's talking about now, like, that's the difference. There's not a demand for labor in the same way that there was at that time. But that eventually phases out, funny enough, because that labor was forced to compete, or white labor was forced to compete with these convict leasing black folks, particularly black men, and white folks were getting mad, like, we can't get jobs, so we got to work, we got to compete with them. So eventually it was abolished because of that. You know, it's
also how some of the stupid narratives about migrants coming from other countries, even early on, like, parallels can be made there. Oh, well, the Mexicans are taking all of our jobs. No, y'all, except then there were actual jobs to compete for, and there's nobody who's going to pay you when they are forcing folks to do it essentially for free. Whereas now, y'all are not doing the fucking jobs that migrants are struggling to come here and risking their lives for to begin with. But some of those same this is when we talk about, like, how myths get perpetuated, like things that happened then that are now taking place. People are just like, yeah.
We worked through that era, so eventually that's abolished, and that kind of motive it's still there, but not to the extent, you know, because again, convict leasing phases out, you know, a little bit early into the 1900s. So you work your way up to the Great Depression, and I think this is something I appreciate with Ruthie's work is, you know, we don't often talk about the overall political economy when we talk about prisons, even though people like to bring the profit thing up, like what's also going on in the general world, not just prisons. So this is going to seem kind of out of place, but it'll make sense when we come back to this later. So the Great Depression happens in 1929, or the stock market crash in 1929, which launches the Great Depression, I should say. And this kind of marks the end of what we call laissez-faire capitalism. And that is the kind of capitalism that in some ways it feels like the United States is returning to. But this was this kind of capitalism where the government really didn't get involved in day-to-day activity of business to the extent that it does now, or that it has in the past. It pretty much just let markets work their way out. In layman terms, that just means, like, you know, there weren't a lot of regulations. If shit went wrong and a bunch of people got laid off, they would just, quote unquote, let the market correct itself. They weren't going to, like, put you on unemployment insurance. You know, there wasn't going to be any kind of safety net for you. You were just going to have to figure it out. Yeah, so, like, once that goes down and the economy crashes, the world economy, not just the United States, crashes, there becomes a bit of a crisis of like what to do when capitalism was in a crisis. You have to also remember there was just the Bolshevik Revolution was just 12 years before this in Russia and the Soviet Union, and there is a real competition going on between, you know, communism and capitalism. So this also doesn't look good for capitalism. So there becomes this new way of structuring capitalism, because even capitalism is always going to be capitalism, but there are different ways to structure capitalism. As far as like what kind of rules and regulations guide policy and such, and how things work. So you get this what's called, you know, Keynesian economics from John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist. Keynesian economics is theory whose premise is that the aggregate demand is a primary driver of the economy and the employment. So in layman terms, again, this is the government should empower the consumer to keep spending in circulation. So instead of just Cam gets laid off and we just let the market correct itself and Cam get a job in 7 months, the government intervenes and creates things for Cam to do so Cam can go get a job and keep spending money that keeps money in circulation for the economy. And that will help uplift the economy as things as things recover. That's the theory. I'm not getting into a debate of it. I will say often people confuse Keynesian economics with socialism sometimes, because they think socialism is simply the government doing things, or the government simply like intervening in any capacity. That doesn't mean Keynesian economics is all bad, but it's just interesting how sometimes people confuse those things. Again, this might seem out of place for an episode on prisons, but to understand how the economy is structured, and then how this structure of the economy eventually falls apart, is how we get mass incarceration, which we'll get to later. So, so this, again, in this sense, the government intervenes in the private sector to finance spending initiatives such as construction projects, boost employment, inject money. So you get things like the New Deal under Roosevelt, where you got unemployment insurance, you get Social Security, you get protections for farmers, you get a National Labor Relations Board, and you get the right for collective bargaining for within unions, and you see union density rise. And then you get World War II, where you really see the economic boom of Keynesian economics, because part of what everybody got put to work to do by the government was to make war weapons, to make war manufacture, to make things for the war, you know. And we're going to talk about California later, but California was one of the biggest states where a lot of Black people particularly like flew to those areas, like in Richmond, California, and things of that nature, just to work for whatever war manufacturing company that was largely deployed by the government, but it also created these huge like war profiteers. And that's where we get the term like the military industrial complex, right? So it really talks about the organizational structures and fiscal powers that have been designed and authorized the New Deal social welfare agencies, provided the template for Pentagon painstaking transformation from a periodically expanded and contracted Department of War to the largest and mostly bureaucracy of the federal government. So used to just to be the Department of War, now you have the State Department, and you have huge spending that just goes towards war. And then when people complain about the military budget that the United States has, this is the era where that really starts taking off, where that really becomes ridiculous and takes over a huge sum of the amount of money that goes in and out of the so-called government, and that taxpayers, quote unquote, are basically footing the bill for and giving contracts out and things of that nature, because war is always profitable. She says the wealth produced from warfare spending underwrote the motley welfare agency that took from during the Great Depression, but did not become fully operational until the end of World War II. The social project of Keynesianism, following from the central logic that full unemployment of resources enhances rather than impedes the production of new wealth, was to extend to workers unequally, as we have seen, as in Black people didn't get a lot of these protections in the same way, protections against calamity and opportunities for advancement. In some, Keynesianism was a capitalist project that produced an array of social goods that had not existed under the preceding or laissez-faire capitalist state form. So a lot of what we know to be like normal life comes out of this era. And that's why a lot of people you hear now are complaining, because a lot of that shit seems to be going away. Like stable jobs, benefits, you know, like 40 hours a week, This is the shit. These kind of standards were established around this era. Eventually, these standards start to fade away, and prison becomes one of those things to solve the loss of some of these standards. So moving forward into like the Keynesian era pretty much goes into the early 70s before there's a recession. But while that's happening, there's also these provocations about crime, right? And how crime is the boogeyman and such. So, we've talked about this before. So just again, to speed through it, there was a war on crime that originally Johnson launches, not Nixon. Johnson launches the Law Enforcement Assistance Act, which is a means of trying to nationalize the police and starts giving out weapons to the police. Now, Johnson also launches the war on poverty, so he's trying to offset like poverty, law enforcement, whatever. But eventually, it just becomes all about law enforcement. That's what the state does. So there's omnibus crime bill, and we talked about that in multiple episodes. And it basically gives block grants to governments, or excuse me, not the governments, give block grants to police departments, and it expands. So if like in 1968, 1969, LEE appropriations more than quadrupled to $260 million in 1970, still doubling to $529 million in 1971, growing to 27-fold to $1.75 billion between 1968 and 1972. So you have these huge transfers of money that are building up, like the state capacity, or as Ruthie talks about, organized violence, like the actual monopoly on violence, like that is their means of doing it. So eventually this program phases out, and then Nixon comes in. Again, we've talked about this, and you get the war. You get the tough on crime, which is what he runs on in 68. In the 70s, he starts talking about the war on drugs. What I do find interesting with Nixon is initially when he launches the war on drugs, it was still more money put into what would be considered public health, as in helping people who are on drugs, and less money in law enforcement. And then over time, you start seeing that go the other direction, and now it's more money in law enforcement and less money put into public health, when drugs is more of a public health problem than anything else, right? As in, these are people who might need help, not necessarily who need to go in a cell, but coming back to, penitence, penitentiary, now we think they need to go in a cell and somehow learn about their problems, and maybe they'll reflect on it and come out sober or something. And that we know that doesn't really work. So this is never been a program that makes sense. So, the Drug Enforcement Agency, as we know, the DEA, is established under Nixon. And then there's always the infamous quote that we've read, I feel like on like 4 episodes, but I always like to read it.
You know what this war on drugs was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and niggas. Well, he says black people. But the doors was closed. It was like, you understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with weed and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
Yes.
Amen.
You would see that same quote in your favorite civil rights documentary, in documentaries when they talk about drugs, talk about incarceration. You'll see that quote used time and time again.
Yeah. John Ehrlichman, assistant to the president for domestic affairs under President Nixon. I read an article preparing for this. It was in Vox that was arguing that quote may have not been telling the truth, but that was what they led with the headline. But even people in the article was like, well, Nixon was a racist, and it eventually did become more about putting people in prison than it did getting them off drugs. So they were like, well, it might be oversimplistic. I'm like, that's effectively what happened. When you look at the numbers. So there is other things going on. Again, like Cam said at the beginning, we're not hitting everything. Just giving you the broader scope so you can understand the general problem. There's also the Rockefeller drug laws, which precedes like the war on drugs. This is in the 70s. And this is under the Rockefeller drug laws, the penalty of selling 2 ounces or more of heroin, morphine, raw or prepared opium, cocaine, or cannabis, or possessing for 4 ounces or more of the same substance was a minimum of 15 years to life in prison and a maximum of 25 years to life in prison. So you have these Rockefeller drug laws, which are what we understand now as mandatory minimums, as in no matter what, if you get hit with this much, there's a minimum amount of time that you're going to get, and that's just what it is. There used to be that there was discretion that the judge could make, giving them the circumstances of why you have these drugs or whatever. Those laws were removed. This was considered extreme at the time, even by hardliners when he did this. Now, this followed the Attica uprising, and Rockefeller was the governor in New York when Attica happened. He's the one that ordered the shooting of prisoners and hostages, and was willing to kill not only prisoners but even the guards themselves to prove a point. So in part 3, that's when we're gonna talk to Ori Simon Burton and deal with how part of prison expansion is just straight up counterinsurgency, and how part of the expansion was to quell that kind of revolutionary aspiration. And even when Cam was talking about some of these programs, like the school programs, part of those being instituted, they say in their own documentation, was to circumvent a lot of the revolutionary activity that was going on, because prisoners were given their own classes. So they started giving classes themselves to bring legitimacy to prisons. So that's a whole interesting history that we'll get into in part 3. Counterinsurgency is a part of the expansion. So you have this like war on crime thing that's been hyped up. And you have this idea of crime and these people coming from the outside who have, who are taking over our economy or whatever, even though these are people who literally live here. And that's the radicals, that's the black folks, that's, and even in some cases, that's the immigrants starting there. But there's also just like a total collapse, but there's also a crisis in the economy itself. Coming into the 70s, like there's a recession that happens in the early 70s. The United States comes off the gold standard in the early 70s. There's a first you had stagflation, then you have major inflation, and to the point where Nixon himself even froze wages and froze any kind of hikes, and everything just kind of froze in place. So you have this economic crisis going on because capital is transitioning to a different model of capitalism than it was formerly doing under the Keynesian model. So you have, like Ruthie talks about, tax revolts. She says capitalist tax revolts fought and federal and state legislators at the federal bank provoked the decline in military Keynesianism. The primary definers of the system's demise laid responsibility at the door of unruly people of color rather than the halls of capital, where overdevelopment of productive capacity weighted against future earnings and therefore demanded a new relation with labor mediated by the state. The tax revolts are effectively the social welfare that was established under Keynesian economics. We don't want to pay it anymore. Mm-hmm. All this helping out poor people and shit, secure jobs, social wealth, we're not interested. And then you start hearing about the big government stuff later. That's part and parcel of that narrative. We're going to shrink government, create more opportunities to protect capital. So you have this economic downturn, steep unemployment deepened the effects of high inflation for workers and their families. Big corporations eliminated jobs, factories and high-wage heavy industries, auto, steel, rubber, decimating entire regions of the country, emptying cities of wealth and people. So a lot of people, remember, they didn't have to go to college. And we hear about this shit now, like you didn't have to go to college. You can leave high school and go work at the steel factory, the auto factory.
You might not have even went to high school.
Yeah.
You might have started work early.
Yeah.
And rose your way up.
Yeah. And you could have a decent paying job. Go ahead.
Yeah. Especially on farms and stuff. Agro business, agricultural business.
Yeah.
But
workers, cars being made,
mm-hmm.
all of those things. And of course, when you start shutting all that shit down and folks don't have no money and they don't have no job and the government on their bullshit, what do you think is about to brew?
It's a powder keg.
So is that
essentially?
Is that also where you get the decline of people doing like apprentice work and stuff?
Yeah, all of that, because it becomes professionalized now. You got to go get a degree or something, right? Like that more so happens in the 80s, but this is the beginnings in the 70s of what eventually leads to that.
This would produce that, or
Yeah. So, you also, I mean, there's so many things going on. That's why I said this is more complicated, because you have like what people like to call white flight. I don't particularly like that term because it lacks any class analysis, so it assumes that all white people just left. Some white people do not have the money to leave the neighborhood is becoming blacker. They're stuck there. Certain white people do have money, so they leave. So there's also a flight of capital, because it's money and it's taxes and all of those things that leave the city. It's the different resources that leave. It's not just white people. It's all the shit that comes with white people that leaves the city and goes to the suburbs. And this isn't in the research, but I always just found this era interesting, because at the time, not just in the United States, but around the world, that finally all these countries and empires are required to include everyone within the so-called economic pie, or what Yannick once called dispossession. But once everybody's supposed to be included, all of a sudden you see this deregulation and this withdrawal of money, right? This is also when you see
Makes sense, yeah.
School, when you see private schools popping up. This is when you see the Christian, creating all these private schools. That's just the United States, but even when you go overseas, you start seeing, like we talked about with Lumumba, all those settlers start leaving and taking all their money with them and taking it back to their mother country, and forcing those new independent countries to now live by themselves and figure things out, while they put sanctions on them, while they raise rates and stuff of that nature. So it's interesting at this time in which civil rights are gained in the United States, in which quote unquote independence is gained around the the third world, the global south, whatever you want to call it. There's this flight of capital. All of a sudden, this money starts leaving the areas that we were once in. The moment that you have to share, I've always
Makes
found
sense.
that.
Yeah,
I've always found that interesting. I don't think that's
not in my neighborhood.
Yeah, So the moment you have to share, all of a sudden we withdrawing everything, and it's a crisis. And we not connecting the money to the gold standard anymore. And not that was perfect either. And we're gonna start creating basically the speculative market. That's how you get the financialization of everything. And now everybody has to use credit to finance. When at this time, that was another thing. At this time, a lot of times you paid a lot of this shit out of your own check. You didn't have to have a credit card and all of that stuff. So this is a changing of the economy that I don't think people like. This is the era I think just gets jumped over.
Credit back in the day was, you go into the corner store, you go to the meat market, and you got $5, but you got $8 worth of food, and they're just like, give it to me next week, because they know you. That was a community thing. That wasn't something that was really sensationalized like this.
Yeah, having a $5,000 credit limit was not a thing back then. You know what I'm saying? like it's just, that was, because you didn't need it in the same way that you would need it today to finance everything. So again, credit existed, but not at the scale. And that's just as on the consumer level. That's not even getting to the way that corporations borrow money today, the way that even governments borrow money, and now pretty much the entire economy functions on debt.
Makes sense. Yeah, because once you institutionalize credit, it's a way of keeping certain groups of people pushed out.
Yeah.
Like I said, not in my neighborhood. This is what, and then kind of like how you said, you started seeing that rhetoric with, get it on your own, every man for themselves, so it makes complete, perfect sense. Yeah. That's it.
I mean, when in the book I got coming out, I tried to touch on some of this because I just found it's an interesting shift. And you can't prove everything, but that's why I said it's just interesting to notice that the moment that the world is supposed to open up for everybody to actually benefit from it, all of this money starts flying elsewhere, and everything becomes deregulated and where we can't actually enjoy the so-called wealth that was created in the way that it was made, when it was mainly just white folks benefiting from it.
Like you say, you probably won't be able to prove it, but the breadcrumbs are still there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, she said, this last quote, and we'll, quite to the contrary, the nation was being prepped for global development by operators firmly ensconced in state institutions such as the Federal Reserve Bank, governors who, as Edward Dickens argues, powerfully insisted that states' capacity to discipline labor was politically and economically more important than the state's capacity to guarantee labor a decent share of the surplus value. So that's pretty close right there to what I'm saying. So because you got to remember, labor was winning gains. We were winning gains. A lot of people, the world was improving for a lot of folks at the time. And now all of a sudden there's this, we're going to go to this neo-colonial, neoliberal model around the world,
Yeah, they definitely got pushed around the world. Oh my, yeah.
So
yeah, the free market ideas of like,
yeah,
yes, every man for himself. Let's do this.
yeah. So
You can be rich too. Go ahead.
yeah. You can do it too, and very individualized. So you eventually get this downturn created, and this downturn in the economy created a series of surplus. You have a surplus of capital that cannot find, particularly finance capital, that cannot find places to invest, because the government has receded as far as intervening. You have a surplus of labor because people are being laid off because of the flight of capital. You have a surplus of land because a lot of these, like Ryan talked about, the agricultural businesses, agricultural land, and just even places where factories were and things of that nature, capital has left. So these are just blighted areas. And you have a surplus in way of state capacity because the state is not really intervening to do anything about these problems. You just have this huge surplus of issues, and it creates a crisis. So what's to be done? So she says, to sum it up, there is a moral panic over crime. This is Ruthie again. Civil order, idle youth on the streets, people of color out of control, women and children without husbands and fathers, students who believe it is their job to change the world, not merely to understand it, and political alliances among organizations trying to merge into full-scale movements. In other words, there is a social crisis, and there is also an economic panic, capital disorder, or the profits crisis. These crises collide and combine into the crises that prison fixes, and fixes is in quotes. So prison becomes this collapse for all these different things that we've named, to kind of like, okay, we can't really get people to invest in government the way we once did. So can we at least get them to invest in prison? We've already pushed this narrative that there's all this crime going on. And again, I don't want to push it like it's just some kind of conspiratorial thing. This is a collapsing of different factors and then just kind of finding a solution to the problem. So we have the crime that even actually is not even really on the rise at this point. It's actually declining. We have drugs, which drug usage had declined in the 60s, the peak of it. We have all these issues. What do we do? And prison becomes this kind of fix all to these social problems because you can just, as they say, lock them up and throw away the key kind of thing. And it also becomes a way to bring money back in, to invest in, to build up the capacity. Becomes a way to solve for labor because you have people who aren't going to get hired anywhere. You put them in prison, or you give them the job that runs the prison. And then you have the land, you build prisons on top of it, and then the state can actually finance those construction projects, and the state can build it, and capital can loan the money, and we just keep doing it. So I hope that makes sense for people listening. I know that's a lot, but go ahead, Terrell.
I would say you don't have to worry about employing 500 homeless people or whatever if you just lock up 250.
Yeah. And you give the other 250 a job to make sure they stay locked up, right? In some small city that used to have a factory somewhere,
Used to have a factory, but then
they win because of the social control that comes from it. The actual profit is that the state now has a solution to its problems that, when you think of it as a whole, and especially once we start really talking about mass incarceration and filling these prisons, it's less about making money, but more so about like, what does the state do with its problem in society? And the major problem has always been a lack of desire to actually serve the people.
They have. And this big problem that's created by the state, and the solutions that they come up with when it comes to these prisons, people already suffering because of this big problem. So you bring prisons in, also you offer people jobs in the prison, so that kind of sweeten. So because when you're in a state of crisis, any little job sounds somewhat sweet. So you kind of become complicit in your own social demise and social control in a way.
It's a divide and conquer.
It is.
You either conform or we have a place for you.
Right.
And for those who want to create issues, those who want to actually band together with the people, and we see what happens when we talk about political prisoners, and we have social movements and folks who are advocating for the people on a regular. Oh no, the state can't have that. That doesn't benefit capitalism. That doesn't benefit them. We see it all the time, even now with the election cycle coming up. These fuckers are out here pandering already, wanting to sit down and pretend that they've been doing things to support. And people get called out left and right every time these things happen, because there's people who fold, and there are people who are going to call you out on your bullshit and be like, no, you. And we see this happening then too.
Even the ideas of prison abolition and how that it started in prisons, but then how that becomes really watered down and whitewashed for the most part.
Yeah,
And,
academic.
Academics come in, and it becomes a fad, a trend, to the point where you're not even kind of lose the radical roots of what abolition actually is and what it really means. And people, again, become complicit in their own social control. And you see this happening even with the funding of the police. It comes down to just little reforms that don't mean shit in the long run.
And what's interesting is we're gonna get into the example of with California. We're gonna use that as a case study. Is there was. And also, even in the next episode, we're going to talk about how some of the things that people were demanding legitimately, the state uses as loopholes, similar to what we talked about with 13. They use the 13th Amendment. They use things as loopholes to actually expand the very things that folks are pushing back against. But no one, thought that was coming, because they were just asking for certain reforms that then lead to, oh, now we got more prisons. We just wanted y'all to make the ones we in better, or just get rid of them at all. And they're like, oh, we gonna build more off of that premise. So Ruthie's book primarily deals with, we're quoting from two books here, technically, Abolition Geography and Golden Gulag, but most of what we're gonna be quoting moving forward is Golden Gulag. But her book deals primarily with California, the political economy of California, and how they built prisons. So I want to say, just as a preface, the way California did it is not going to be the exact way every state built and expanded prisons. There's going to be different stories for every state. So what we're saying here, when we explain this about California, is not to say that there is some the singular way that it happened in every state within the United States. That's not what's being said. But this is the case.
It's not the same as what happened
Right.
in Alabama and vice versa. We know that laws are different.
Yeah.
The political climate in those states are going to be very different. But I think, like you said earlier, so often when we talk about these things, we talk about them on a wide scale.
Federal level, yeah.
Yeah, we're just talking about things that encompass everywhere in the country. But by focusing on how one state specifically did it, I think can help paint a better picture for folks. And besides that, it's my fucked up ass state that is today's problem. But I think this will give folks an opportunity to be like, damn, if this is how one state did it, a fake ass progressive state, compared to everyone else, what does this then look like? Or when you go do your own research at home, what does this then look like in my state?
And I had their own,
especially if you live in the deep South, where it might be far more insidious. And how do these things get replicated, or at the same time be taking place in reflection of how they do now?
Yeah. Well, for now, but
it's not a one size fits all.
No.
A lot of it was replicated all over the place.
Yeah, there are definitely parallels, but it's just important to, since we try to push a more materialist perspective here, always to deal with the conditions for what they are, and not try to, extrapolate that to be something more than it is. Because that's the very thing we're critiquing, is people, it's the people doing that, taking one era, just, employing it to another one without really studying it for what it is. So with that being
But
said,
California offers a good framework.
It does.
To apply across
yeah,
different boards,
right,
different states.
as a means of understanding it. Yeah. So,
Mhm.
so this is I want to make sure people even get the chapter. So this is chapter 3 of the book that we're primarily pulling from, and it's called The Prison Fix. So this is broken up into the sections within that chapter. So there's a section of from reform to punishment. So it's interesting that in California, they used to at least say on the books that rehabilitation, going back to the penitent's point about penitentiaries, was supposed to be part of why they part was supposed to be part of the service of prisons was rehabilitating people. Now we laugh at that and we know that that's not ever really been a thing, but it at least was on the books. That's something that needed to be, that was supposed to happen. Over time, they removed that from even being a law, even technically speaking. So she talks about reform prison conditions became a loophole to expand prisons. So part of what's also happening is, we've talked about like George Jackson and such. Like George Jackson was in California when he was assassinated. We talked about like different prison movements that were going on. So there's a lot of prisoners, and this isn't just, just California, but just that's the point. And people were saying like, "Oh, these prisons are horrible. The conditions are ridiculous. They're unsanitary. They're old. The buildings are crumbling." And people are getting these ridiculous sentences from 1 year to 99 years, which is a sentence that George Jackson actually got, was 1 to 99 years, as they call them indeterminate sentences. And so the state of California uses that as a means to actually expand prisons.
It's like, cute. Y'all said that this prison sucks. There's too many of you in here. Oh, okay. Well, instead of letting some of y'all out, we're just going to build another one. So there's room for you. Yeah.
Originally under the guise of rehabilitation. So we're gonna renovate them. But there's also an influx of activists coming into prisons. She lays this out. She says the ensuing criminalization of such activists swept what were in record numbers of men and women off the streets into custody. With California in the vanguard, the state's prison population grew from about 16,500 to just about 23,000 between 1967 and 1971. The number rose and fell within a narrow band over the next few years, peaking at about 25,000 in 1974 and bottoming out to about 20,000 in 1977. So you have this up and down flow, but there's all these protests in the streets. And then Orasami Burton's book, he's talking about he mainly focused on New York, but he talks about how by 1972, and this is nationally, there was so many people who had been arrested for the so-called riots and rebellions in the streets that by 1972, you saw more prison uprisings in the history than you ever had up to that point. So there's a correlation between people who were being arrested for protesting and fighting against the state and then sending them to prison, and then there being uprisings inside prison. So there is something there. So prison activists, some of those activists who were being pulled off the street, thrown into prison, are challenging these conditions. The California Department of Corrections uses pressure to expand and remove rehabilitation. So in 1977, there was the Uniform Determinate Sentencing Act, and it removes rehabilitation as a primary goal. This is a quote. The 1977 Uniform Determinate Sentencing Act was California's formal abdication of any responsibility to rehabilitate, stating neatly, the purpose of imprisonment for crime is punishment. Period. So there's not like
it's over.
Yeah. So there was Governor Jerry Brown, who was actually a Democrat, and he wanted to build small prisons and renovate old ones, but his plan eventually was expanded to build new ones. So this is another quote. The same year, 1982, the legislature successfully petitioned voters to approve about $500 million in general obligation funds. This is going to be important. We'll just hear later, to build new prisons, general obligation funds, based on the argument that more prison cells would enhance public safety and punish wrongdoers. So they're saying there's a general social welfare to building more prisons. This is what I mean by social welfare being less about investing in people and more about punishment. You see how these things are starting to collide. So also in 1982, legislature reorganized a statutory relationship between itself, the CDC, and the prison expansion project by forming a new entity, the Joint Legislative Committee on Prison Construction and Operations. So they merge these things together. This is like, that's what I'm saying. On a state level, when they do this shit, this is where they really get slick with it. So then in 82, a Republican governor comes in, and he's on the bandwagon. I don't even know how to say this man's name. I'd like
Dukimon.
Yeah,
I prefer to
close
call
enough.
I'm sorry, what?
George Dukimon.
I don't know how to say the man's name. He looks like
I'm laughing at Kim. Kim did that on purpose.
Yeah. So he wins at 82. This is the other quote, completed the term.
So, I just feel like mispronouncing his German-ass last name as Dukimon just works perfectly.
Yeah, I don't think unless people want to look this book, you can just read the book if you want to get the name.
But he
for sure.
heard that, he about to go after folks who get welfare. He was like, yeah, we need to clean house. Fuck all these people.
So he used she says he used the accumulating illegitimacy exemplified by tax revolts to attack the status quo, starting with the weakest targets, such as persons receiving welfare. So this is 82. So now you had Reagan. Now we can bring Reagan back into it, who ran on the small government or get rid of big government, welfare queens, the Southern strategy. Like Reagan has done this and gotten in office. So this dude, George Dukimon, rides that wave. And comes in, and what do? They start targeting the smallest of people, like the welfare queens and such, and we need to get rid of them, and we need to clean up crime on the streets, even though again in 1982 crime had actually been down at that point. So why are we even talking about crime? So when Dukimon takes office in 83, the administration brought in, this is Ruthie again, Jerry Brown's new prison plan, but dropped rehabilitation as reason for new buildings, with punishment in form of incapacitation. Now the rationale for the prison administration, the legislature, and the CDC, the correctional department, all three partially consolidated, joined forces to expand the state's built capacity for incarceration. Says states still had two immediate problems though. First, how do we guarantee potential prisons? And second, how do we finance the facilities that cage them? So even though we want to, we have this idea to finance prisons, how do we get them and how do we fill them? So now they need the capital, land, and prisoners to fill their plan for expansion. So you see the collapse of the economy coincides with what they end up doing here. So this is the section of what she calls capital for construction. So although the legislator had passed, this whole part is crazy to me, but all the legislator had passed convinced the public to approve the general bonds funds. They were weary of greenlighting too many public taxpayer finance projects. So basically, we got the public to approve it, but if we were to actually start financing prisons, they were fearful that the public would not really go with it, because at this time, this was not seen as a general way to solve problems yet.
Of course, what do? This is the 80s, y'all. Y'all already know the answer to this. It starts with the P. Propaganda.
Yeah.
And in the book, it literally says that the problem becomes how to then expand a politically popular program such as prison without running up the contradictory limits to taxpayer willingness to use their own money to defend against their own fears. So they knew if they were just like, we want to build more prisons because we don't fucking like y'all poor people. We don't like Black people. We don't like anybody who has anything to say against what we as the state want to do. How do we convince the rest of y'all to go with this?
Exactly.
Of course, what do? This is where we get crack babies. This is where we get all the ads for crime. This is where we see more ads for policing. The boys in blue type of bullshit, the news running robberies and breaking in your house and attacking your grandmas, and all of this shit.
Moral panic. Yeah, moral panic. Yeah. And
so right here, the capitalists and the statesmen crafted a new way to borrow money from prisons, from existing debt-raising capacities. The scheme involved using lease revenue bonds to supplement the GOB debt.
So lease revenue bonds, LRBs, are different than the general than the GOB debt. We talked about the general obligation General obligation bonds. Yeah, so the general obligation bonds are different than the lease revenue bonds. This is where they get real slick, though. So Sacramento's old and new guards are ready to unite behind the prison program, but they had to raise much more money than anyone was brave or full-handedly enough to request from voters. So the lease revenue bonds were the solution. This is a quote: the lease revenues, or LRBs, are issued by public works boards of the state of California, established in 1946 to help smooth crises as California adjusted to a post-war economy. Typically, LRBs issued by the Public Works Board are for real property loans for veterans and farmers, as well as loans for public college and university facilities and hospital bonds. It was a risky but successful political suspension to disbelief to use a state-implied moral obligation to script a scenario in which the Public Works Board and CDC were characterized as entities buying, selling, and leasing property and rights between them. So, in short, LRBs do not need voter approval. GOBs do.
Ooh.
And to take an LRB, you can approve that as the legislator without anybody voting on it. But LRBs were generally used to fund public works programs such as universities, schools, roads, things of that nature. So they raid the public works department and saying they're doing a deal with the correctional department, and they're doing a deal between each other, and they're using that money to then finance prisons.
And of course, they can find that money because guess who wasn't getting that money to begin with? Black folks.
And what's wild is the LRBs, just to point to the profit point, LRBs actually have a higher interest rate than GOBs. But LRBs, but because LRBs,
because they're borrowing against themselves. It's
borrowing
against the state.
But because LRBs are do not need voter approval, you'll go with LRBs even if it's more money, because I don't have to go through anybody's voting at the time, right? So she says, quote, LRBs do not have to be placed before voters in general elections on an approval by the legislator. They can be relatively quickly organized and issued in order to maximize favorable credit conditions, enabling the CDC to build prisons closer to the time the facilities are bid on, and thus theoretically avoiding cost hikes. So we can get the money quicker, and maybe we can offset that because we can avoid the cost hikes that will have to go through the GOB. Again, this shit is like, seems complicated, but when you see them kind of just playing with the money, like you said, this is how it went down. So in less than a decade, the amount of state debt for the prison construction project expanded from $763 million to $4.9 billion, a proportional increase of 3.6% to 16.6% of the state's total debt for all purposes.
The state's rights, though, right?
State's rights. Note this, because this episode is not just on the history of prisons as a whole, but also tying back to the myth of prison for profit. Niggas were not profiting at all. They were losing money.
The debt went up.
The debt is going through the roof because of the creation of more prisons and more spaces. And so when you think about why would they be willing to go into such debt, a losing battle where there's not money being made, why would they be willing to risk this in order to create more cells? Who was going to fill these cells? Who were they going to intend to remove in order to make these be legitimate?
Yeah, so they applied what's called the state of emergency approach. And that's playing off of this idea that there's a bunch of crime going on. So the end run around taxpayer voters in order to raise what turned out to be more than $2.5 billion in LRBs, in addition to nearly $2.5 billion in GOBs, because they still use the GOBs, but they couldn't use it. They couldn't use the entire fund. Was thus not only a political strategy of economics subterfuge, but also one of social policy that set the Golden State in a new direction. So now they have to find where these. Okay, now we've got the money part figured out. Where are the prisons going to go? So we raided the public works, where the prisons going to go. So this is the land part. For a typical facility built in 1982, the building yards, parking lots, and road perimeter fences incorporate about 300 to 350 acres. But land was not easy to find. They couldn't put it in They couldn't put it in Los Angeles because the mothers there, the group of Latino mothers, actually organized to say, no, we don't want it in Los Angeles. So you're not going to put it here. She said, the The anti-LA righteousness, which turned out on an almost patriotic notion of the duty, cloaked the eagerness of small-town delegations who came to Sacramento looking for prisons to revive isolated, flagging economies. The flight of capital, as I talked about earlier, left land available, so you had industry closures, downsizing, capital abandonment, left large tracts of land available for development. So you have all these places where factories have left, where money is left, nothing's there anymore. This is the organized abandonment she talks about. And she talks also about another myth of these small towns. Sometimes we tend to think they're all white. She says, contrary to contemporary folklore, the towns where prisons were sited, while deeply divided by class, not all Anglo communities, unlike Los Angeles, political opposition to prison development was more easily managed for pro-prison forces, aided by CDC's persuasive perspectives, promising jobs and other amenities. And you have this major abandonment of land. We already have seen 100,000 acres per year of irrigated agricultural land and be coming out of production starting in 1978. 100,000 acres. 18 of the 24 new prisons cited between 1982 and 1988 were or are being built on formerly irrigated agricultural land. So literally the land that was abandoned by capital is the land that prisons were built on in most cases.
That's
If
nice.
you know anything about the landscape of California, and you've ever been to a prison, like I have been to quite a few of them in the state, they are very far out from the cities. They are very, when you are on the road, you feel like you're going to the middle of nowhere. And oftentimes, and we talked about this earlier today, there are also a ton of military bases all over California. So a lot of people initially, the military did the same thing. They were buying up a lot of these acres of land that had also been abandoned. But the really tiny towns that a lot of the prisons now that exist that were being built on back then, not only were they built on farmland, but like the farmland was actually decimated. Like you think that you're going desert now. And so when you think about folks talking about prison for profit, and you are looking at articles lately that are talking about agriculture work, in California specifically, majority of these prisons are on destroyed land. Like
famine.
They cleared them completely. Like they are dry. You would be shocked if you had looked at pictures online of what they would have looked like 10 years before they started to actually build on them, to know that anything could even grow there. So they are not out here growing food or working in that capacity to make any type of profit. This was really about, there was empty space. We have money. We want to put bodies in these spaces soon. So now we can just acquire this land and build these prisons. We done finessed all this money out.
Yeah. I mean, again, this chapter is just fascinating.
Right.
And then you get the, so yeah, I mean, effectively you have a surplus. I'll read this the last quote on the land part. Surplus land. Well, there's one other quote. I don't want to read the whole thing, but just basically the finance capital who would finance these buildings or give away, not finance the buildings, but who would give away the property. Like Cam said, it was basically destroyed. So it's like, why would you give away the property? Because effectively, like if it becomes a prison, then the other things around it will improve, and that will raise the value of the land. So I can make money in the long run, even though right now I'm not making any money by selling it to the state because I've already losing money anyway. So I'm just giving away dead shit. We'll see how it works. So the last quote, surplus land connects to surplus labor. As in the past, rural capital has successfully externalized to the state costs associated with change in production. Prison development has had the intended, although rarely realized, effect of providing jobs and therefore supplementing household incomes for workers who presumably would be less likely to organize for jobs, higher wages, or more radical goods, such as land reform that could be gained only at capital's expense. So it's a way to, again, discipline people. So it's like, okay, so these folks cannot rise up in many ways. Like, let's just give them these prison jobs and let's fill these cities with that shit. That's an easy way to control them. You know, even though statistics actually show that when prisons come to your town, things don't get better. Domestic violence rates go up. You know, like alcoholism rises because working in prisons is not a very healthy thing. You know, but they didn't know that at the time.
Anybody who is or what is a former prison guard, a lot of them tell you that they feel just as institutionalized, especially folks who did it because they lived in some of these middle of nowhere spaces and just needed a job, who may not have actually had an insidious desire to work for the state, but was optionless, who then was like, I cannot do the horrific things y'all are asking me to do unless, like, have a cousin who worked in a prison, and she literally, like, will not speak about that time.
Yeah, it's like
same. I have a friend.
Yeah.
I have a friend that worked in the prison, and that experience messed him up for, like, he wouldn't reach out to any of us, meaning his close friends, for about a good year or so. It was even hard to get him to talk about it. But when he finally did, he realized, he was traumatized, and then
it's sad because, I mean, she's in her 60s now. She's my great cousin, but even she says, she was like, yeah, I couldn't do that for more than a year because, you know, even the areas in which she worked in she was working on more of the social work aspect in Nebraska. But to see what's happening in those spaces, to know the type of people who are going in there and coming back out horrible people, or the ways in which they're also inflicting state violence against others inside of these walls, is deplorable. And so it's like, when folks are making money, like, they're not actually profiting from this. And we talked about this earlier, as we were just all chatting about the stuff that we went through, of like, folks, when we talk about profit, it's not the people who just have a job and then they're not profiting. Like, laborers as well are not making money, especially in comparison to the output of labor that they're doing. Like,
yeah, like, you're not, if you are a worker anywhere, you don't profit. And I think that the people tend to associate profit with making money. They aren't exactly the same thing. You are a worker anywhere. It doesn't, prisons or anywhere else, you're paid a wage which is already factored into the expenses of the capitalist. Like, your labor is just part
an expense to them,
Yeah,
actually.
absolutely.
You are not somebody they're counting in their benefits. Like, you're an expense.
Yeah, you're not making money. You're not profiting like the way profit is. Like, I paid 2, I made 5. You are included in the 2, and then whatever I make in that extra 3, that's my money. If I'm the capitalist, you're not part of that, so you're not profiting in the literal sense. You're not getting the surplus value that the capitalist gets. You know, so that doesn't even really hold up. Most people aren't profiting, even if they're making money. Now, the thing about Ruthie talks about, they have a vested interest in maintaining the thing because they are paid a wage. So because I do work here, I have a vested interest in keeping it going, as we talked about on with the prisoner union guard, or the prison guard unions. But I'm not profiting in the classical sense that we understand the term. That distinction does matter for people who want to make this argument. You know, be a little bit more precise. So, coming to the prisoners themselves. Okay, now we have land, and we have the means of financing it. We have land for the prisons, and we have the means of financing the prisons. We stole from public works. We're taking land that was abandoned by capital, and we are going to put prisons there. But how are we going to put people in prison? Because right now the laws don't really facilitate building all these prisons. So you get stricter laws. You know, so it's like this is the quote: the legislature changed the classification of certain offenses such as residential burglary and domestic assault to felonies requiring prison terms upon conviction. So once upon a time, those things didn't serve that much time. The rationale for laws purported to be reducing violence in communities. The means was sentence enhancement or intensified incapacitation to prevent people from committing crimes by keeping them in cages for as long as possible. So the logic was...
Every other episode, crime is made up bullshit that the state gets to choose what is actually a crime. See that with the ways in which these sentences just magically get expanded from things that they previously didn't give a fuck about, or they didn't think were actually that harmful to society. Now they're like, actually, I gotta fill these prisons. We need to get this popping. So let me go ahead and expand these things. Let me make it look nice and wrapped in a bow because we need to prevent crime. And this is where we also see issues with recidivism, and we see other things being exacted that, like, if you do your time, if you do the crime, you do the time bullshit. But when folks are getting out, there are also a ton of laws to keep people coming back to prison, because if you have a felony, which they now are making minor offenses considered a felony. If you have a felony, you don't qualify for any social programs, and this still exists today. If you have a felony, you cannot get stamps, you cannot get housing assistance, you cannot get FAFSA money to go to college. So then you get out of prison, but the options are limited for how you can become a productive member of society. For the audio folks, I'm using all the finger folks.
So-called citizen,
No, even in certain
many of these things, you can't participate, you can't vote, you can't leave the country, you can't get a passport. So of course, if you are unable in so many ways to become an active citizen and do good again, then a lot of folks end up back doing many of the things that the state identifies as a crime due to survival needs, and they end up right back in it. So like, they're not only creating laws to get folks in the prison doors to begin with,
out of circulate.
They also created laws to keep this in circulation. Like the cycle was horrific. It and that was, is, and still is. And it's not for something as simple as they wanted to make money about it. They were like, how do we continue to create a method to control society?
Yeah. And you had legislators, he talks about all across the political spectrum. So another problem with this conversation is it gets blamed on one party or the other, and that's not really the point either. So from Robert Presley, who Republican in the state of California, Riverside, Bill Jones, Republican in Fresno, on the right to Jim Costa, the Democrat in Fresno, in the center to Maxine Waters, who a lot of people fell in love with when Trump got in office, on the left, sponsored sentence-enhancing legislation. Almost everybody sponsors some law, collectively creating a plethora of new crimes for the state's 58 district attorneys to prosecute. Now, this is not this again. We want to make sure we're not suggesting that everybody met in the room and decided that this is what they was going to do, because that's not how shit works. A lot of these politicians, whether they agreed or not, probably thought they even had people coming to them about crime. Because again, if the citizenry is gassed up about crime, then and the population is gassed up about crime because the media is stoking those flames, the moral panic is going on, they'll be demanding those laws themselves. You know what I mean? It don't even require anybody to, it doesn't necessarily require to always be a top-down thing. If you can stoke it enough, people will sign up, and be like, yeah, we want to lock people up, blah, 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 because you're hearing about crack on the news and you don't want that shit to come to your neighborhood or whatever, so a bunch of people are trying to solve the problem in problematic ways. Go ahead, Terrell.
No, isn't that, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when you get to like the 98 crime bill and stuff with Bill Clinton. 94, sorry.
Yeah.
And he says, I did what you guys asked me for.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also in response to overhyped media, propaganda saying that this is the cause, this is what's going on there. Yeah.
Yeah,
it becomes its own cycle, essentially.
Yeah.
That's not taking the blame away from him.
No, but that's the best way to do something is to make people believe, is to gas them up enough to where they believe it's the actual solution. And everybody feels like they have to act, even as a politician, in my own self-interest, to stay in office, whether I agree with this law or not. If people are asking for it, and it's not just some rich folks somewhere, but it's a decent share of people, even if there are real dissenters, then I have to respond if I want to stay in office. Like, all these incentives are tied to things. So even if everybody's not, quote unquote, in on the plot, all of these politicians weren't involved in actually raiding public works, they have to respond to this so-called crisis. So that's why she means by prison becomes a catch-all for everything, because it's just an easy way to, everybody can collapse around that solution,
Right. I mean, and to Terrell's point about the 94 crime bill, the Black Caucus who supported that. There's a lot of Black people, again, hyped up by the media, by propaganda, who are in favor of that bill.
And there are, and to be fair, there are real things happening in neighborhoods. Like, I don't want to say, do have some real shit going down. Like, there is a real scourge of problems, and there are murders, there are robberies. there is a lack of safety. That's not all conjured up in people's heads. Like, they are
Definitely.
looking outside their door and seeing some really scary shit. It's just the solution to that is not more prisons, because those people just cycle in and out and come back and do the same thing. But it is real life happening to people, particularly Black folks and brown folks are experiencing that. So you get why that gets gassed up. It's just, you know, it's...
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and because you're in a crisis, kind of like what I said earlier, the crisis essentially are created by the state, you know, and then you manipulate the people who are experiencing this crisis, mostly the marginalized, the people who are in poverty, Black people, brown people, and get them to, again, be complicit in their own social control, their own demise. Again, then it comes to its own cycle. You get the population riled up, you know, through propaganda, and then you present these policies that are going to ultimately hurt that group of people, and then get the people to support those policies. Those policies are passed, and it becomes a cycle. Nothing ever gets solved.
And then eventually people realize that shit doesn't work, as we see more so nowadays, but it's too late, you know, and then people make money. And then the same people like the Koch brothers and stuff come in 13th and make money off of that. Like, well, we went too far, so here's some ankle bracelets. You can sit in your home 23 hours a day. You ain't got to go to the physical prison, and that's reform. You know, like that's the
and
that's the laundering.
And people like the Koch brothers, the capitalists, they see an opening in the market, and they exploit that, like you just said. Even though private prisons are only 7%, that's an opening for people, like I said, like the Koch brothers, can make a little profit here. You know?
Yeah, you see, like, oh, this thing is booming. Like, yeah, I'm gonna get in on it, but it's a parasitic relationship. You come in after the fact, and you exploit it. It's the thief that robs the drug dealer. You know what I'm saying? Like, you realize there's a market, something happened. I'm gonna come in, I'm gonna insert my way here, and I'm gonna exploit this. I'm gonna get a little bit off the top. But that, you know, the thieves that rob the drug dealers are not the driving reason why drugs are getting dealt. You know what I mean? So
they're leeching. At the end of the day.
Yeah, they're leeching on to an already created market. They're not the driver of the market. Like, that's private prisons. Effectively, like, you're finding a way to fit yourself into something that's pre-existing that you didn't even create. You know,
and there's something really disgusting, wicked about trying to blame all this on private prisons when they're only such a small portion of the actual problem. It's kind of like smoke and mirrors, like a bait and switch type of a deal, where, okay, we can blame all this on private prisons making profit and all this other stuff. When in all actuality, I think we've said this plenty of times, is counterinsurgency. You know, through the 70s, you see prison uprisings. You see that happen. I mean, from locking up a lot of activists, and you see prison rebellions happen, revolts, and I mean, the state notices. They take notice of everything.
The state causes the problem, and then creates another problem, but to them it's their solution, which is also bullshit. That just then perpetuates more problems. But the solution for the state is that they win because they keep us all oppressed. They either under the guise of we have to stay in line. You either do what we say, or we have a place for you.
And
which is not an effective model, because it's not going to work forever.
And if for everybody that's listening, if this state is coming up with a solution, or the solution is state funded, then a good 10 times out of 10 is not a real solution.
Nah, even if it feels good, it might be a good way to plug a hole, you know, for like if a bunch of us are dying, and I mean, like,
on the sicking shit.
It's like a ceasefire. Ceasefire is not the solution. Ceasefire will stop the mass slaughter, right? But the occupation needs to end. You know, the whole thing needs to be done away with, right? Ceasefire is part one. So a reform can be okay in that sense, but if you just end with the ceasefire, you're still under occupation. You know what I mean? Like, so that's what we're dealing with here. So, coming back to the research, one of the laws they passed, and then that a lot of people will probably connect with this one, was the Gang Activity, Street Terrorism Enforcement and Preservation Act, STEP Act of 1988. Quote, the legislation that commissioned a state task force on youth gang violence in 1984 was findings reported back to legislator in 1986, resulting in state terrorism, Street Terrorism Enforcement and Prevention Act of 1988, as subsequently amended. With that law, California established a mandate directing all law enforcement agencies to identify street gang members and enroll them in a statewide database. The law enhances sentences imposed on those whom enforcement had identified as street gang members. Now, what does identify even mean? And how do you identify people in gangs? You just can make this up, right? You don't predict and as we know, we all know people who've been loosely affiliated and gotten caught up.
Nobody.
You know,
I don't know
so
what you're talking about. I don't know, motherfucking thing.
you cast
That in the state of California, and a lot of times, and this is something that exists across the board in many states, is that the way that they can now arrest you and identify you, and essentially this is the setup for larger RICO that comes later, is folks who have gang tattoos. You will automatically be then considered a gang member, even if, hypothetically speaking, you only got the tattoo because it was cool. Which I don't know why anybody would be in that, but it happens because not all tattoos were simple, were large, like, hello, look at me, I'm in a gang.
Yeah, and the thing is, on that point, if you're locked up in prison, and again, I don't know this directly, of course, but if you're locked up in prison and you're in prison, you do whatever you can do to survive. So you might join a gang hypothetically in prison and not have anything to do with when you leave, but you can still have the tattoo on there because that's what you did to survive the 5-year bid or whatever. Like that happens more than people are honest with, or just the fact that it don't even have to be a tattoo. You could be in a car with somebody, you could be friends with them, they could be your cousin. Whatever the police puts you in the database, puts you in the database. Like that's the point.
Certain color.
And then
being in the same proximity with them.
Yeah,
being in the neighborhood.
You're not just charged with whatever the alleged crime is, but you're being charged with the crime and for being a gang member.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, but because there's certain people that get like a 5-point star, and everybody gets stars tatted on them. That can be you can affiliate that with a gang if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Now, and
like we said, we don't know no gang members. Gangs don't exist.
Yeah, it's a myth as well. But
no, like you could easily place any kind of identifier on a person and say, oh, they're part of a gang. And then maybe they had small possession charge. Now you get to put that gang thing on them, that gang upgrade on them in certain states that you automatically going in.
Yeah, it's an added, so it's not just like it's been stated. It's not just the whatever you did, the drug charge. It's added. They do this with hate crimes. Interestingly enough, like they just tack it on to if you murdered somebody, then you able to a hate crime on top of it. Like this is the logic basically. So it's like, so now you have the drug, what she calls the drug recriminalization, where drugs that have been decriminalized to some extent now become, criminal acts at a higher extent. So whereas in 1977, drug offenses that accounted for only about 10% of new admissions to the CDC, by 1990, they accounted for 34%. The legislature passed the nation's second 3 strikes law in March 1994. This is California. An initiative on the following November ballot solidified the statute and an expression of the people's will. Politicians of all races and ethnicities merged gang membership, drug use, habitual criminal activity into the singular social scourge, which was then used to explain everything from unruly youth to inner city homicides to the need for more prisons to isolate wrongdoers. Concentrating power through the use of status, terminations, gang, not gang, and mandatory minimums and new laws widen and deepen the capacity of police, prosecutors, and judges to identify, arrest, charge, and convict people and remand them to the CDC custody. We all know this story. So indeed, there is passing more than 100, sometimes beneath 200 pieces of new legislation each year up until 1988, up from the former output of 25 pieces, which included routine amendments and existing statutes. As a result, the racial composition changed. And you look at 1977, there was only a total in California of about 19,000 people in prison, about 20,000 and 19,500 people in prison in 1977. By the year 2000, there's 162,000 people in prison. The racial composition went from 43% Anglo to 29% Anglo, and then black population became the majority. Actually, the Latino population by 2000 became the majority, and then black folks in California, and then other. So again, and then it's like, okay, well, what crime really matters? On one hand, she says the political rhetoric produced and reproduced in media concentrated on the need for laws and prisons to control violence. Crime and violence, these are in air quotes, seem to be identical, however, and it says the table 5 showed there was a significant shift. So in 1980, you had violent crime. It made up 63% of the crimes. And then by 2000, it was only 25%. And then you have 26% for property and 39% for drugs, but drugs only made up 7% of the crimes in 1980, 39% by 2000,
And even from all of this, like when you really think of the ways in which the state aimed to control bodies, like the 3 strikes law is one that really, and for those who don't know what the 3 strikes law, it was if you were convicted of 3 felonies, you then had to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. Shout out to every single person who worked to get this repealed. This has been repealed in the state of California. I have family who would not be out with me today if it wasn't for that being repealed. But
was that retroactive? I don't remember.
Yeah.
Okay.
For non-violent offenses.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a whole nother thing. And
it's a whole nother episode.
A whole nother episode about legal advocacy and all types of shit. But if you reflect back to some of the things we talked about in the beginning of the episode, when you look at the type of laws that were enacted and type of crimes, so to speak, that would have been a misdemeanor that were then turned into a felony. Especially in the state of California, these things are designed to fold right into each other. So if you, and there were other laws that were enacted, if you had multiple misdemeanors, if you got charged with the same offense multiple times, then it would be considered a felony. So things like loitering, vagrancy, vandalism, etc., things that you would typically not think were harmful to society or non-violent offenses could then be considered a felony.
And this wasn't in the notes, or I don't know if Ruthie said this, but it makes me think about how even people that plea out, there's an incentive for prosecutors to force plea bargains because there's just literally not enough. The state doesn't even have enough people to send. Like if everybody went to trial, the whole thing would collapse because they've allowed so many people to be like brought into this. So they have an incentive to hit you with these plea bargains. But what that also, we talked about how they tighten up the law. So they gave prosecutors all this discretion where they could just hit you with so much shit where you're like, I'm facing 500 years. Yeah, I'll plea out to 5.
Yeah, you steer you into the plea deal.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to go to trial with a so-called public, as my brother, public pretender. I don't want to go to trial with one of them, and take the chance. So it also, a lot of what's also not talked about, just the power that prosecutors gained in this stretch, because a lot of that discretion used to be in the judge's hands. Mandatory minimums took a lot of the power out of the judge's hands, put it in the prosecutor's hands, where they could throw the book at you and then force you into a plea bargain that just sends a bunch of people to prison where there's no real way to defend them. Most people can't afford lawyers, especially the people get caught up in this. And then, lastly, kind of to all of this, there is the federal side that we didn't talk about as much, but they created incentives, for police, for states to build prisons. So, for example, under the interjurisdiction, the federal zero tolerance statute allows seizure of any property alleged to have been obtained through use for drug manufacturing, transport, storage, or you sell. And if and when local law enforcement makes a quote unquote federal case out of a drug bust by bringing the federal personnel, allowing defendants to be charged in federal rather than state court, the local jurisdiction gets half of the money of all assets seized in relation to the action. There was also federal dollars to arrest people on drugs, and the state and the federal government would give money to local departments for every drug arrest they made. So they also had less incentive to pursue other things and to arrest people on drugs. They actually had to repeal that, and they had to repeal some of the asset forfeiture laws, even during like the height of the war on drugs, because it got so bad that you had departments that would literally just be like, we're going to fund our department, we're going to go out tonight and just arrest a bunch of people, get the federal money, and fund our department. You know, it was that ridiculous. Michelle Alexander talks about some of that in the new Jim Crow. So it's like the amount of money that was given to incentivize these things from the feds is really where they did the most detriment, because they put all this money into law enforcement that then makes its way into the states and helps them craft their programs. But as y'all can see, this is like really more complicated than just like they're going to wrap everybody up, put them in prison, put them to work, make money off of them, raise their stock prices, and then just keep that system going. This is actually way more insidious, as most myths, once we break the myths of most things are, you know, and this is
kind of turns into a numbers game. Because if you look at Chicago, the Chicago Police Department, how they used to grab people and give them the cop to crimes that they did not do.
Yeah.
And torture them. Yeah. In a lot of cases.
Yeah.
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 That's essentially what you're creating.
Yeah. The thing is, when you set something like this in motion, you create all these other different economies. So just like you create the private prison thing, you create the cops who exploit it for overtime, you know, because you get the cops who raid houses so they can steal half the drug money. You create all these little these surface things on top of the broader structure. That those are the things that tend to make the news, the excesses of the broader system, the private prisons, the corrupt policemen, the prosecutors, the judges who take kickbacks to send kids to private prisons to the specific ones so they can get paid out. Those are the scandals we hear about, but that's all after the fact. That's all that's all a symptom or a consequence of putting something like this in motion. That is not the driving force behind it. But those are the stories that tend to make it. The target making money off farms, all of that is a symptom. You know,
hey, but it's all in the game though, right?
I got the shotgun, you got the briefcase, yeah.
Right?
The Wire.
But like, to come back, I think we showed like, and more so Ruthie's work shows, again, not that California can explain quite literally what happened everywhere else in the same way, because every state has different types of economies, and therefore the crisis varies depending on the situation as well as the people making the decisions. But as you can see with California, this was a lot more intricate than, oh, we just gonna lock people up so we can make some money. It's like, no, we can solve all of our issues if we just lock people up. We can make a little money. We also could just stabilize things. We can shift to a different way of capitalism, different operation of capitalism, you know, and we can move forward. And by the time people notice, the shit will already be put in motion, you know. So it's like for part 3, we didn't deal so much with the explicit counterinsurgency element of it that deals with like the state repression that was directed at revolutionaries and at controlling revolutionary sentiment. So we don't think we forgot that aspect of it. But again, this stuff is it's so complex. There's just so much to it. It has to, you got to break it up, you know. So we could probably do 10 parts on this, but we're only doing 3 because this isn't a full-time job. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I think it should be clear by now. Like these are the types of things that drive prisons, all these vested interests, and prisons kind of just help uphold all those different interests, and then not just being like, oh, we gonna make money directly. Now again, there is profit to be made in the stabilization of markets by putting people in prison and them not being on the streets, and you can make money off of different other things from there, yeah. Or you can discipline labor by having a whole surplus population that doesn't demand union jobs and works in prisons and works in or just lives or is in prisons. Yeah, you can make there's profit to be made indirectly. But I'm not really trying to hear people who come back with that argument, because we know most of the time when people say prisons are built for profit, they're not talking about that. And you can make that case for anything. You could say everything. You could say you send people to school ultimately so they can become workers, ultimately so you can make money. It's a capitalist system. So something always rounds back to profit, but that doesn't explain this specific industry.
Yeah.
Even if
less a profit than it is more of like a tax break. It's really a cost saving tool.
Yeah.
That's
a good way of saying it. Yeah.
Instead of having to actually invest in schooling and welfare that actually is going to help this society, that is going to help population and rehabilitation and mental health advocacy, they're going to put more money in the police prison state to help manage the population. It's like, we don't actually want to do the things that will help society, because if that happens, most of us will realize that it's actually the state that is even more so than the folks that are already aware of what's happening. More people will just be like, the state is fucked up. They are the reasons why all these problems exist for the most part. And collectively, we need to do something about it.
And we would think we deserve more if you invested in people. I mean, that was part of the problem with the Keynesian model, was people did think they deserved more, and then they was like, all right, so
labor unions started to start.
Even Dr. King, like, why are we going to war when we can put all that money? Like, people started wanting more and wanting better, and not in a bad way. And then you like, okay, we need to discipline. We need to keep this down. Like Cam said, it's more of a tax break and an incentive that comes back to you in the long run. It's not a direct, I'm going to put 5 in and get 10 back. It doesn't work.
From a profit space, within outside of the social control, within this capitalistic society that we live within, the mild profit that larger corporations get as a whole, the state doesn't actually care that they're making some chump change, that they're making a little bit of money from the prisons in some small capacity, because then those that we would consider the 1%, the powers that be, the millionaires, the billionaires that are investing in these things and profiting off of this, they will continue to support the initiatives of the state so that the cycle that the state had already had stirring in the pot continues.
Yep. And in some cases, a lot of those millionaires, billionaires are a part of the state. They kind of like erase the
They are the state. Yeah.
I mean, and if we got into, y'all really want to talk about profit? War for profit is really what's making the money, not prison. But that's a whole other subject, and we'll talk about this. So
those are direct contracts that come out of the biggest expenditure of the United States budget that goes directly to war manufacturers or weapons manufacturers. You could call them war manufacturers too, but weapons manufacturers and things of that nature. So that's more of a public-private relationship than prisons ever have been.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it is what it is. I'm not really interested in like forcing people to even, agree. I think that the evidence is definitively clear, but I more so think, if nothing else, I hope people at least walked away with a better understanding of how this got set in motion. And I do appreciate Ruthie's work, because we really don't talk about what happened on the state level enough. I really think most documentaries, most of the time, it's all about Reagan, Nixon, Clinton crime bill. That's the story. You can probably get the average person that can tell you about that. But what the states did, how they figured out what money voters wouldn't have to vote for, and they could, like, that's some slick shit. You don't really get that, So I appreciate her breakdown. I would push everybody not just to read. We mainly went over one chapter, really like 2 chapters, but I would encourage everybody to read the whole book, and really anything. Both of her books, Abolition Geography, as well as definitely read Gulag. because she gives you actually explicitly Marxist breakdown, like a political analysis, like a political economy materialist breakdown of how it went down, when a lot of narratives kind of make it into a boogeyman kind of thing. You know, she really gives you the day-to-day like operations and breaks and takes and demystifies it in ways that I appreciate. But yeah, other than that, unless anyone has anything else to say, we can get out of here.
Fuck the state.
Fuck the state. And with that, definitely listen to us on Spotify, iTunes, Deezer, all your streaming platforms, YouTube. We appreciate y'all. Until next time, yada yada. Peace.
Okay, fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe.